Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Elisa Manacorda. Now I will give the floor to Professor Fabiana Giacomotti, coordinator of the Women 20 Cultural Change Commission. Education first, gender equality starts at school. Professor Giacomotti, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Olivet Hotel. We decided to have this session in two languages, so I'm going to speak Italian. The theme of cultural change is fundamental, and we must talk about cultural change now at the end of the day. Last but not least, culture. After so many other topics, but this theme is fundamental. It is the main theme. I heard many very interesting presentations during the day. I heard that there is the need for cultural change. I heard STEM degrees and many other activities. However, what I have not heard is a change in the language, which is fundamental. This morning, I met a colleague of mine said, well, he had didn't know when Marie Antoinette died. He said, well, it doesn't matter whether she died in 1789 or 1792. I mean, when she died, she was so old and ugly. So you understand that something like that, well, I mean, not only do you show a wrong and a sexist attitude, but also, I mean, you believe that your terrible ignorance is irrelevant. So there is a problem with the approach to language, but there is also a problem with regards to the cultural approach. In the communique that will be published over the next few days and issued and delivered to the G20 leaders, we will talk about girls' needs, the need to grant everyone to fulfill their dreams, which is correct, absolutely correct. However, many of them do not have the possibility to go to school. So before talking about STEM degrees, before getting to making their dreams come true, they have to go to school. They have to go to school in their countries, and they have to obtain that also where the school system is granted to women, like here in Italy. And also, one of the many hypocrisies of this country is when we do not talk about the fact that many girls arrive here in Italy and they disappear from the school system. This should not be accepted in a democratic state. We should do something about it. So this is another one of the aspects to consider. And then there is also a historical aspect. And these projects that we are developing, thanks to Women 20, and it is how and what we can do to change school books. We are producing a list of stories, of gender roles, which are very important for our school system. Because not only in Italy, but nearly all over the world, it was observed that women are not present in books. I mean, they're present only for less than 10%. It is an average, of course, that there are some countries in which they're not present at all. And it is also difficult that a child or a family think about the fundamental role of women if they never find them in books. And it is a problem both for girls because they do not find role models in their books. And it is also a problem for boys because they find that actually, why should we talk about women if women are never present, if they never appear? So we are working on this project, and I've realized that it is absolutely necessary to conduct this work, because we launched an open call to action, open to all through newspapers, and we received very, very few names in percentage terms. I wanted to get to 100, but we only received about 50. So this is certainly a problem. And then there is also a problem of narrative. Now, I will briefly introduce all of our guests before giving them the floor. In alphabetical order: Professor Andrea Carandini, Professor Emeritus of Archaeology and History of Art. He is the author of a book on Agrippas, and it is also very important, and we will talk about it in the next few minutes, because it also describes this figure as a politician. Then we have Professor Elisabetta Camussi, Associate Professor of Social Psychology at the University Bicocca of Milan. And she will have to draw the conclusions of this panel. Then we have the CEO of Salvatore Ferragamo, Michaela Di Velleclemme. We have the CEO of Luisa Spagnoli, Nicoletta Spagnoli, who bears the name of the first great female entrepreneur, an Italian entrepreneur who was her great-grandmother. So there was a generation, a passage, a transfer, generation from generation. And then we have, in connection from Bristol,
Rome, Professor Olivette Otelet, che è ordinario di...
She is Professor of History of Slavery and a member of the Royal Historical Society. So she will be, well, she has to tell us, will be very interesting also because she wrote a book on the relationships between Europe and Africa. And there is also a chapter entitled Women Immigrants in Italy. So I think that that could also be a very interesting approach to this topic, which is very complex. It's a huge topic. But of course, we will need to focus on only some parts of this topic. So I would like to leave the floor to Professor Carandini. I was told by a friend, and this is also the reason why I strongly wanted him to join us today. I was told that when, at the first presentation of his book, someone said, someone wanted to include in the title of the book the word plot. So I would like to explore with him how it was possible that in the course of 2,000 years, starting from Tacitus, who actually considered Agrippa as a woman who had to bear the brunt of being a woman, I would like to ask him why the figure of Agrippina is so controversial. Thank you, Professor, for being with us. Well, I do not really feel prepared in this context, but I would like to tell you briefly that Agrippina, who was born in 15 after Christ and killed by her own son, Nero, in 59, was probably the most powerful woman of the Roman Empire before Adrian. She was related to 4 emperors. She was a niece of Augustus. She was the sister of Caligula. She was the aunt and the wife of Emperor Claudius, and she was the mother of Nero. So an incredible life story made up of death, life and power. Augustus had left his wife Strigonia, so his only daughter hated him. And he found a lover, Triclivia, who was a Claudia, was from the gens Claudia, and the gens Julia believed that they were of divine origin. So when Augustus left this woman and married Livia, there was a problem, a family problem, very important family problem that emerged. And this led to the exile of Julia, the daughter, and she was killed in exile. This also led to the death of Agrippina the Elder, the mother of my Agrippina, Agrippina Minor, who risked of dying because she was exiled by Caligula, but then she was saved and she got married with Claudius, and she became an incredibly powerful woman. This was very unusual in the Roman Empire. Think that she managed to participate hidden behind a curtain to the sessions of the Senate, which not even Livia had managed to do. So Agrippina, after risking her own life like her mother and her grandmother, she ran the risk of governing. And she did govern. For instance, she called Seneca as a teacher of her son Nero. She called Burro as prefect of the Praetorium. And she proved a great governor. She was very skilled, but if Claudius tolerated her, well, her son did not tolerate her because she wanted to govern in his place, and this was impossible in Rome because Rome was a patriarchal society based on male power. So she challenged this power, and in the end, her son Nero tried to kill her, to drown her, but she was saved. She swam to her villa, and on the next morning, Nero had her killed the next day. But this woman she was born too early in a society that could not understand nor tolerate her. And for what we know, she governed very well. Also because she understood that her son was a person who could have never managed the empire with the balance that she had earned through her experience as a woman that was at the center of power, though she did not have power, though she did not hold power. So her good governance was also the cause for her death. Then, in the 2nd century, there were other women who were even more powerful than her, like Faustina the Elder, who was the wife of Antoninus Pius, and Faustina the Minor, wife of Marcus Aurelius, but they are exceptions. However, they are forerunners. They were forerunners of the modern times. In fact, you have to understand that in Rome, the emperor's wife was not an empress. The prince's wife was not a princess. They had the title of Augustus. They had no political authority, no authority on the state. However, they had governance capacities. And as these women were both mothers and wives of the most powerful men in the empire, well, of course, they could not mix and mingle with the power, but they had to be able to manage power. For instance, when Nero was young, he was appointed emperor when he was 17. So clearly it was natural that she had to govern in his stead. as he was very, not expert at the beginning. But then that led to her fall. I think that this symbolic figure should be studied even further also because she had an incredible awareness of herself. In fact, she published some commentaries, some memories, what we would call memories, that ancient historians quote. In fact, she knew everything as she lived at the Palatinum, the Palace of Power. And this shows that she had also reflected on her position and also on the many women that came before her. Unfortunately, these writings, Agrippina's writings, are long lost. So that is why I decided to write this book about her, because I wanted to have a member of the Julian family, a woman who could give her point of view on Roman history from her special perspective. Now, this is quite an interesting history, which unfortunately has long been lost. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Carandini. I wanted to ask you something about Agrippina's memoirs. But thank you for clarifying that they were lost. I would like to leave the floor now to someone who, like most of the ladies who are here, or maybe has not enough self-awareness, who knows. It is quite difficult for a woman to be assertive, maybe because self-assertiveness means to be a woman of power. This is a question that I would like to ask the Vice President Michaela Lodivelec, the CEO of Salvatore Ferragamo, and then to the CEO of Luisa Spagnoli, Nicoletta Spagnoli. So, Michaela Lodivelec, well, it doesn't matter. There are very few women in the fashion world, and Luisa Spagnoli and Salvatore Ferragamo represent unique cases in the fashion world. Women in the fashion world are under either foundresses or owners, or they find it very difficult to reach the top managerial levels. But so how did you work in your company? What did you do in your company to bring about a cultural change to include more women at the top levels? Because we are talking about a sector in which women are very little represented. Thank you. Well, I have to say that in the fashion industry there are many, many women, not so much in managerial positions, but it is a markedly feminine sector. There are also maybe... I do not want to talk about biases, but women in the fashion world are normally associated to models, female models, or to the person that works to produce clothing, or to people working in shops. Well, I like this question on assertiveness, because this is one of the topics that has always interested me. And I think that this comes also from a cultural model that suggests that women in positions of leadership, of responsibility, wanted to replicate some models that maybe do not belong to women because they are more masculine models. I think that there are leadership models that can be applied and used by women while they feel women. They go beyond assertiveness, and they can lead to what I would call circular leadership models, in which all the teams are involved, in which we always try and involve our collaborators. We try and work on sharing goals, on supporting ourselves, on distributing responsibilities. We do not impose our viewpoint. Of course, managers take the brunt of all the responsibilities. But this is a model that probably is not fully developed in Italy. I remember that as a child, when I thought about my future, about my professional career, my professional model was Marisa Bellisario. She was the first woman in the 1980s, the first female Italian manager in Italy, who really had a difficult life, and she focused on a merit-based leadership approach. She promoted her team, her collaborators, and she really focused on teamwork. These are all themes which are still very, very important. I do not think that there is a ready-made solution or just one solution, and most especially female leadership is another one of the themes that cannot be found in books, because you try to also talk about gender, but when we talk about leadership, there is just one model. Yes, normally there is one model, which is probably an easier model, because the assertive approach is an approach that that enables the team to avoid any responsibility. There is no common goal in this type of approach. A very famous designer, Albert Lebas, when I met him years ago, he said something that made me reflect on the role of the CEO in a company, but also on the role of the creative director. And even though he was a man, he used the metaphor that recalls the feminine leadership model, because he said a creative director, like a CEO, is like a mom in a company. In fact, being a mother is something that you do not learn, you do not teach how to be a mom. However, you have to deal with different realities, and at the same time you have to stimulate, you have to encourage the children, the family, without necessarily imposing your viewpoint or your decisions. And this is absolutely true, because the motherly model is a model that is not used nowadays in companies, in the business world, not even in the fashion world, but it is a model that over time has shown in some situations very good outcomes. Think about Salvatore Ferragamo and the Lady Ferragamo model led the company to be where it is today. We applied a culture education that came from her motherhood, from being the mother of many children, from her strong sense of responsibility, and from her spirit of belonging, which is the concept of community. However, the concept of community is often in conflict with the concept, or rather the need to grow, to bring results, to achieve goals. But I would like to know something. The language that you met over the past few years, because I know that you worked in Gucci for many years. I would like to know whether this somehow showed you that in some way the fact that you're a woman could generate problems or not, could be viewed as a problem or not, to myself or to the company. Well, I have to say that, quite the opposite. I have to say that I had very positive returns, not only in terms of outcomes. For instance, I worked for Gucci during the during the change in the creative approach, and at that time it was necessary to recreate a new culture of engagement, of empathy, because we had to retrain all the shop assistants that had to engage clients in a different way. And after so many years, seeing that still today this model can be perceived by the end client, the fact that they still use that model, well, that gave great outcomes in terms of numbers, in terms of income, of course, for the group, but also in terms of personal and team satisfaction. Thank you. we will go back to this theme. I would like to ask Nicoletta Spagnoli. She's a member of a family where skills were handed down generation from generation, but also the approach, the managerial approach, was handed down generation from generation. And everything is based on merit. We have to think that Nicoletta's great-grandmother, she was not only one of the first great female Italian entrepreneurs, that she was the very first one, but she was also a woman who brought, probably as Mrs. Ladie-Balek said, she focused on women's needs. She opened kindergartens at the beginning of the 20th century. We're talking about over 100 years ago. So she carried out a series of activities that could favor female employment. Of course, she had to deal with an incredible number of problems. But I would like to ask you a provocatory question. When you select candidates, new collaborators, I mean, if would you select, as they do in the UK at the moment, would you select without any indication on the gender? So by simply looking at a CV, would you only consider qualifications? Well, to us, merit comes first. That is the most important thing. That is the main goal for us. And we have always focused on merit. We try to support our personnel, our staff. We have never, ever made any gender distinction and any difference between men and women. As I told you, the first manager in our company, one of the first ones in Italy, was someone who worked for us. Mrs. Pimpinelli, that was her name, and she was the director of one of our departments back in the 1940s. And then we've had many of them at the time of my grandfather, my father, and also under my direction. There are many women who work for me in top positions. Merit comes first. And as women are a great value, and we have to enhance. Now, in both your companies, the feminine presence is quite high. I mean, in your company is 90%, we know it. But is there any specific attention that you give also to the cultural approach of those who come to you? I mean, newcomers and new employees, do they find a favorable approach, also in a favorable environment in terms of multiculturality, diversity, in terms also of language? Yes, of course. It has always been normal for us to have women in our company. It has always been normal. So now we have the problem of the quotas for gender equality. Well, they are absolutely useless for us because we have always had women. The point, what you said about multiculturality, well, that has, we appreciate it. It is a value. It is important for us. Well, do you also have people, women from other countries that joined your company? People that have women from different cultures. This is a very relevant theme. And I have to say that one of the reasons why we have here two representatives, two important representatives of the Italian fashion world, is because the fashion has always been ahead of times, and it has always anticipated the cultural change. At the moment, the current cultural changes that we see in fashion is the quickest, is advancing at a very fast pace. There is a very strong commitment. There has also been a commitment in terms of in a commitment in cultural and ethnic diversity. Things do not always work. However, you give yourselves these goals. It is a goal that do you think that should be pursued, and are you pursuing it? Yes, of course, it has to be pursued, and we are starting to open up to this, to multiculturalism. Absolutely, yes, it is, and certainly I'm sure that these things will continue so, because now things go like that. Now, I would like to leave the floor to Professor Olivette Othelet. She has connected.
And to meet you at last in person. E mi domando se, visto che nel suo libro
I would like to ask, in your book, Africans Europeans, The Untold History,
you all to read, veramente, veramente molto importante.
Because it is really very important, it is important to read it, because it is an important outlook on our history, on the history of Europe, and most especially on the history of Africa and Northern Africa in particular, over the course of many centuries. Well, she devoted a chapter that I really liked to the techniques of approach to fashion, to language, to aesthetics of immigrants, African immigrants to Italy, who start, especially in northern Italy, who are many in northern Italy. So I would like to know from you if you think that this approach and these changes that are underway are actually evolving, and therefore whether they are really building a cultural and multicultural society, or if we are still at the very beginning. I have a bit of difficulty in seeing this, given what happened in the UK over the past couple of days. We've seen really terrible scenes, but I would like to focus on very general terms. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for having me, and I'm hugely grateful for your invitation, and I wish I were there with you, actually. I would like to kind of address two things here. The idea that, multiculturalism is just born out of thin air, it's not correct. It's something that we need to work on. It's something that is dynamic and progressive, and there's no end or beginning, actually. And in the book, I do talk about the initiatives put in place by several women across Europe, minority ethnic women across Europe, to kind of circumvent discriminations and to set up their own companies, to kind of have access to education and so on. And again, they have had to use their imagination, but also they have worked with many people who are allies and who have supported them along the way. I also wanted to, I've been listening to the conversation, and for me, the idea of merit, I'm not sure if it's a translation or not, but meritocracy has a bad reputation. Meritocracy means that we're starting from the same place. You work hard, you will be rewarded. If you're a migrant woman, you work hard, you will be rewarded. But there are other things that come into place when it comes to actually being able to work this hard. The social, economic environment, access to resources. Some of these women are mothers. Some of them, just like European women, are also mothers. But there's the layers of discrimination that we call intersectionality that needs to be looked at. It's not just about having access to the workforce, but also being able to look at the cultural discriminatory background. In other words, these women are discriminated in their daily lives. By the time they come to work, if they have a job, they come to work, they start from a different viewpoint. In other words, should we talk about equality, we need to talk about equity, because we're not starting all from the same place. So meritocracy in that environment is something that is very loose, and that can be discriminatory in a sense. What is it that we put in place for them to have access to that ladder that allows them to give their full potential?
And this question has to be asked to both of you. It's wonderful to talk about meritocracy when we all start from the same level, at the same level. But if we talk about meritocracy when you do not have access to the same resources or the same kind of education, well, it's harder, much harder. And this is an extremely relevant topic, and we struggle objectively to deal with that, because for us, the issue is right. We all have access to universities if we want. We have access to education, a public education that is anyway guaranteed, but it's not the same thing. Actually, that's the point. That's one of the reasons for which there are in many sectors, and not only in the fashion, some programs, like the Chamber of Fashion has just launched one program to approach and educate and develop, but there are still some niches, small things to overcome. So, needless to say, the problem that we are facing of language or access to roles, role models, what Professor Italy is saying is absolutely huge as a concept. So this requires a change, I believe, in the perspective we assume. So I would like to ask Professor Camusi to dwell on this, the need to introduce a change that is not only cultural one, a way of thinking, a mindset. So before going back to Professor Italy, I would like to listen to what's the approach of a psychologist, social psychologist, as Professor Camusi. Please, you have the floor. Thank you, Fabiana Giacomotti. Well, actually, I prepared my speech in English because working at university, for us, it's commonly used as working shared language. So forgive my English, but I would like to deliver this speech in English. If you can please also resume this topic of my question. Yes, in my speech I will start from the very beginning and by answering to your question that you have introduced.
So, starting from the beginning, thank you for inviting me, a social psychologist. If I have to summarize today's presentation, answering the basic assumption, education first, I'd ask ourselves why, in the age of human rights, we still have to tackle gender stereotypes. So I'll try to answer, giving you some food for thought about the roots of gender stereotypes, the importance of social influence, the different levels of intervention, to close with some final remarks. Gender stereotypes are automatic and unconscious cognitive processes, therefore unavoidable. They are internalized from childhood onwards, working as self-prescribed patterns of attitudes and behaviors. And these attitudes and behaviors must be adhered to under penalty to be socially sanctioned. Stereotypes are the result of the categorization process, a cognitive process we use starting from our birth to distinguish objects and then people, grouping them by similarity among them and by difference among categories. For those reasons, it's illusory to think of erasing stereotypes, while it's instead essential to foster in society the awareness of the existence of gender stereotypes and the distortion of reality they generate in all contexts. Think about education, job roles, the development of biased AI systems, domestic violence, and so on. This is the key to understand the problem. All kinds of stereotypes contain descriptive information about category members. We mean generic and simplified description of categories of people, functional to organize my expectation toward an individual in advance, because I know he or she belongs to a group. But gender stereotypes contain both descriptive and prescriptive components. The descriptive ones consist of beliefs about the characteristics that women and men do possess, while the prescriptive ones consist of beliefs about the characteristics that the women and men should possess to be recognized as belonging to the right group, women defined as communal and men as agentic. Descriptive and prescriptive components of gender stereotypes lead to different expectations of men and women or boys and girls with regard to skills, personality attributes, self-concept, vocational aptitudes and careers. These expectations are transmitted to children beginning with the day of their birth by parents, teachers, peers, the media, and other agents of socialization. Obviously, these expectations have a strong impact on girls' and boys' educational careers. Nowadays, we know that these stereotypical and opposite descriptions of men and women have resulted in a historical asymmetry and exclusion of women from the public sphere, with all the ensuing consequences. Fortunately, psychology and social sciences have taught us the power of social influence, the role of modeling, and the importance of acting to promote social change, working strategically and at the same time on three different levels: the micro, meso, and macro level. That's to say, the individual, the group, and the social political levels. All three levels are very important, but the last one, the macro level, is crucial, includes national systems, regulation, and cultures, and takes into account the social, political, economic, and other forces that impact societies and individuals, as intersectional perspective suggests. Focusing on the interconnection among the levels, from a psychological point of view, we have had some classical scholars like Uri Bronfenbrenner, who proposed in the 70s the ecological system theory based on the dynamic interaction that environments have on developing children. His work looked beyond individual development, taking into account wider influencing factors and the context of development. During the same period, Albert Bandura published the Modeling and Social Learning Theory, which emphasized the importance of observing, modeling, and imitating the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. Individuals that are observed are called models. In society, children are surrounded by many influential models, such as parents, characters in the media and in the textbooks, peer group, and teachers. These models provide examples of behavior to observe and imitate. It tests masculine and feminine behaviors or prosocial and antisocial behavior. Starting from parents, we know they are the most important socializing agents for children before they start attending school. Parents act as model, share their knowledge, expectation, and desired behaviors. These expectations concern many aspects of social life, without forgetting gender roles and gender conformity, acting as implicit attitudes and beliefs. Then school arrives to play its crucial role in gender role socialization because it represents the institution par excellence. Teachers usually have a strong influence in the perpetuation of gender stereotypes, generally because of their unconscious biases. As some colleagues of mine have written, think engineer, think male, it's probably the new think manager, think male that dominated the 90s. To give you an interesting example of asymmetries at school, let me tell you that the most of research show that girls are more often praised by teachers for their efforts, while boys for their abilities. And speaking about classical research as well as current study on textbooks, they found a remarkably similar pattern of gender bias virtually worldwide. Females, humans or animals were strongly underrepresented. Women and girls included in text or illustration were nearly always depicted in highly stereotyped roles in the home. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I have to stop this part of my speech, even if I would like to go further into the topic and decide if I can tell you something more during my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Camussi, per questa messa a punto.
Thank you for finalizing and underlying the bias that and the hurdles that many of us have, women as well, in interiorizing and expressing on the gender roles. But I wanted to go back to Professor Ozele, because I have a question at this point. I've been wondering for 2 days. I wanted to do that in person, but we do it remotely. What happened in the UK that over the last years is trying to teach to the whole world to be politically correct. And it demonstrated that it is a country that is far away from the objectives that it has set to itself, that tries to impose to the others. How do you think? Was it for ethnical reasons, for gender, of course, reasons? Over the last days, we witnessed it. A representation of a country we didn't expect to find in this condition. So I'm wondering if you think that studies, which are very important and relevant, to which you are devoting yourself for many years now, will leave trace. And how are you applying these studies for a country where the majority revealed itself so far from what is a multicultural project that instead Europe is pushing?
Two layers really to this question. So the first one is that multiculturalism is an ongoing, it's a reality, whether you call it multiculturalism or not. There is and there has been black and minority ethnic presence in European countries and kingdoms for centuries, hence my book. But more importantly, it's whether you call it multiculturalism or cultural diversity or whatever, it's something that is ongoing in terms of how do we learn to live together. So the politically correct is simply a way to say you don't have to shout, you don't have to spew your hatred at the person next door to you. In other words, it's common human decency to just simply say things in a polite way. And I think that, it has its merit. I grew up in Paris and I grew up in France. There's no politically correct. And through my childhood, I was abused verbally, physically, by people who thought that, free speech meant expressing themselves properly and expressing their. So I'm quite grateful for not having to witness that on a daily basis. What it does underline connect to the last few events underline that there's a minority of extremists, and that minority of extremists have been allowed to get away with things simply because the vast majority of people have been the silent majority. The silent majority are the ones that we need to shake up, and we need to tell them that you have, in a way, been accomplice to these people. In a way, you have allowed this to happen by simply standing on the fence or not actually openly denouncing it. And what we have seen in the last few days with the football is the level of violence is increasing. It's a backlash, of course, because what is happening, and I think it's across Europe, is that people are losing their privileges. People are losing the kind of position of power where they were put in place because of their birth, because of the way they look, because of the color of their skin, and they do not accept the fact that multiculturalism actually means stepping back sometimes, actually means sometimes using things you care deeply, which is the position of power, which is the automatic access to academia, which is automatic access to services that have been denied to others. So if you're fighting for equality, it means you're accepting that others will have access to that equality too.
Thank you so much for this aspect that to us, of course, it's a food for inspiration because to a certain extent, we are lagging behind in history compared to other countries, the history of multiculturalism, but I hope we can approach it in a less conflictual way, despite still is highly conflictual to us as well. As Professor Otele said, this requires a commitment by everyone, also in the approach, in the linguistic and lexical approach that cannot be only connected to something that is imposed, but should be the result of an evolution. I would say that in certain conditions, in some countries of the world, there are some problems I was mentioning at the beginning, which are not only being a woman and not wanting to be approached in an unpleasant way, but it's a problem of accessing education, health, food, even food and work. So talking about a cultural change to a certain extent, and this was also a very clear speech by Professor Otele, it's a sort of luxury that we can afford in our countries. So anyway, this can be most of all a thrust, a driver towards a future where we try not only to include, but also to understand and to open up opportunities for that little that we can do. It's a very important shift, this cultural change. I don't see this in the textbooks, I don't see this in my generation, so I really hope that it's going to be more present in the next generations to come. Professor Camusi, would you like to add something? Yes, I can do that in Italian. We are getting to the conclusions. I think it's very important, everything we said up to this moment. But this requires an investment, as Fabiana Giacomotti just said, that is a systematic one. So reasoning in terms of national plans that are functional, working on the awareness of existence of diversities and asymmetries and
delle rappresentazioni stereotipate dei diversi gruppi sociali, quello femminile, maschile e non solo. Questo è fondamentale perché il nostro sistema cognitivo funziona solo nel cambiare atteggiamenti, mantenerli nel loro cambiamento, nella misura in cui l'insieme dei contesti nei quali siamo immersi ci sollecita nella medesima direzione. Questo vuol dire ad esempio che il lavoro di analisi che è stato compiuto negli
la famiglia.
I genitori e tutti coloro i quali possono svolgere un ruolo importante, perché Fabiana ha ragione, la famiglia è fondamentale, ma c'è un effetto ancora più importante che quello dato dal contesto scolastico, per un semplice fatto che formare gli insegnanti è più facile che formare i genitori, perché sono una categoria professionale e le insegnanti nello stesso tempo raggiungono da sole un grande numero di persone e possono quindi agire come un fattore di promozione radicale, intanto che nel frattempo ovviamente si opera per una revisione totale dei testi scolastici, che è un'operazione lunga e costosa che può essere in qualche modo accompagnata intanto da una discussione critica guidata da insegnanti formate rispetto a quello che è presente. Ovviamente la famiglia deve essere poi successivamente sintonizzata su questo stesso livello di consapevolezza che finché riguarda solo poche fasce della popolazione o riguarda progetti specifici anche di ottima qualità non produce però il cambiamento sociale che noi desidereremo promuovere.
Grazie, mi sembrano le conclusioni perfette. Quindi ringrazio il professor Carandini, non lo vedo più, credo che sia sparito sulle Bari di Maiorca dove si trovava, quindi non riesco a salutarlo. Ringrazio da lontano ancora Olivetto Telè, con cui avevo fatto una lunghissima conversazione mesi fa per un numero di Vogue, appunto sulle tanti gender bias e anche race bias che affliggono la nostra società. Spero di averla qui a Roma prima o poi, quando questo Covid sarà, si spera, finito e non avremo anche la quarta ondata. E ringrazio la dottoressa Nicoletta Spagnoli, la dottoressa Michaela Ledivelec-Lemmi e la professoressa Elisabetta Camusi. Lascio a questo punto a Martina Rogato il compito di trarre le conclusioni della giornata. Grazie.
Grazie Fabiana, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this amazing. Please, un applauso, grazie per il nostro speaker. Okay. Thank you so much for our outstanding
Grazie per il livello così eminente di speaker che hanno passato questa giornata con noi per condividere il women empowerment e la gender equality. Grazie allo staff tecnico, gli sponsor, i partner, alla Camera di Commercio di Roma per averci ospitato e un abbraccio virtuale a tutti i nostri delegati per aver supportato noi da 20 stati. Grazie per la vostra attenzione, ci vediamo domani per il Day 2. Vi auguro una piacevole serata. Grazie.
Bene, grazie.